April 28, 1945, Bavaria, Germany. In a farmhouse cellar somewhere in the Bavarian countryside, Greta Hoffmann crouched in the darkness with a choice in each hand. The left held a small glass capsule filled with potassium cyanide, standard issue for Blitzmittel auxiliaries who might face capture. The right clutched her Wehrmacht identification papers, now essentially a death warrant if the enemy found them. She was 22 years old, a communications auxiliary from Munich who'd spent the war routing messages and managing logistics far from any combat zone. But on this spring evening, with American artillery rumbling in the distance and the mechanical growl of Sherman tanks echoing through the valley, Greta Hoffmann was more terrified of liberation than she'd ever been of Allied bombs. She wasn't alone in her fear. Beside her in the cramped cellar huddled 4 other young women, all auxiliaries, all clutching their own capsules. Ilse, 20, had started praying an hour ago, not for salvation, but for courage to use the cyanide before the Americans arrived. They'd all heard the broadcasts, absorbed the warnings, whispered the stories late at night in their barracks. Joseph Goebbels himself had told them what to expect. The enemy brings not liberation, but annihilation. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. American soldiers, they'd been told, would commit unspeakable atrocities. Mass rape, execution of prisoners, particular brutality reserved for women who'd served the Reich. The final propaganda ministry broadcasts in April 1945 had been apocalyptic in their warnings, painting a picture of Allied occupation that made death seem merciful by comparison. The statistics would later reveal the depth of this psychological warfare. In Berlin alone, an estimated 7,000 people committed suicide in the spring of 1945 as Allied forces closed in. Across Germany, suicide rates among women in areas about to be captured spiked dramatically. The Reich had distributed cyanide capsules not just to military personnel but to loyal party members and their families. An entire nation had been prepared not for defeat, but for martyrdom. And the preparation wasn't entirely fabrication. Whispered accounts from the Eastern Front told of genuine horrors in Soviet-occupied territories. The women in that Bavarian cellar had no reason to believe the Americans would be any different. The sounds changed. Boots on the floorboards above. Commands in English, harsh, foreign, incomprehensible. The systematic clearing of rooms, professional and thorough. Greta's hands shook. The smell reached them before anything else. Diesel fuel and American cigarettes, an alien combination that somehow smelled like power and abundance. Ilse's prayers became more urgent. Then silence. Then footsteps on the cellar stairs. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by daylight. An American soldier. A black American soldier. Greta's entire worldview fractured in that moment. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't shout. He simply signaled them up with one hand while keeping his rifle pointed safely at the ground. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and overwhelming. They'd been told Americans were savages. This man was offering his hand to help Ilse climb the steep stairs. What happened next bore no resemblance to the nightmare they'd prepared for. On the farmhouse floor, they were lined up and searched, but by female American military police, women in uniform, another shock to their system. Weapons were confiscated efficiently. There was no violence, no leering, no groping hands or whispered threats. General Eisenhower's non-fraternization policy was clearly in effect, enforced by MPs who treated the whole operation with bureaucratic detachment. The women were loaded onto trucks bound for a processing camp, guarded but not threatened. Greta still clutched the cyanide capsule in her closed fist. She hadn't needed it yet, but old fears die hard. Night fell on their first day in American captivity at a temporary POW camp near Augsburg. By May 1945, U.S. forces would hold over 5 million German prisoners of war, a logistical nightmare managed with characteristic American organizational efficiency. The women were separated into their own compound, processed through a system that felt surreal in its mundanity. There was paperwork, medical screening, delousing procedures. They stood in lines, waiting for interrogation and torture that never came. Instead, an army doctor examined them. Captain something or other. Greta noticed the Jewish surname on his jacket and felt her stomach drop. This was it surely. The revenge would come from him. He checked Ilse's infected foot wound with gentle hands, prescribed sulfa powder, wrapped it in clean bandages. His touch was professional, clinical, nothing more. Greta found herself more confused than relieved. None of this made sense. Their first meal as prisoners of war contained more calories than German civilians had seen in weeks. K-rations, bitter coffee, bread that wasn't mixed with sawdust. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. They were being fed better as captured enemies than as loyal citizens of the Reich. That night, they slept in barracks, crude but weatherproof, with actual blankets. Guards patrolled outside, but no one entered. No midnight selections. No demands for favors. Just the quiet routine of military discipline applied to prisoner management. Greta lay on her bunk in the darkness, listening to the other women breathe. Some cried softly. Others slept the sleep of exhaustion. She opened her hand and looked at the cyanide capsule one last time, then rose and walked to the latrine. She held it over the hole for a long moment before letting it drop. She wouldn't say she trusted the Americans, not yet, not after everything she'd been taught. But she was confused enough to wait and see. And confusion, she was beginning to realize, might be the first step toward understanding that everything she'd believed was a carefully constructed lie. May 15, 1945, 2 weeks into captivity. The morning roll call at the women's POW camp near Landsberg had become routine, efficient, boring, utterly, bewilderingly bureaucratic. Greta stood in formation with 200 other women, watching American sergeants check clipboards and count heads with the enthusiasm of postal workers sorting mail. Where was the brutality? Where was the chaos they'd been promised? Instead, there were work details, kitchen duty, laundry, camp maintenance, all assigned with the kind of tedious fairness that made the whole situation feel absurd. Female auxiliaries had been classified as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, which meant they were actually paid for their labor, 80 cents per day in camp scrip. The Americans were following international law with their captured enemies while Germany lay in ruins, laws abandoned. The abundance was what broke them, slowly and inexorably. Red Cross parcels arrived weekly. Chocolate, cigarettes, soap that actually lathered. German prisoners received Swiss Red Cross aid while German civilians starved in the rubble of their cities. The medical clinic operated like a small hospital. Dental work, vitamin supplements, treatment without discrimination. Clean water flowed from taps. Meals arrived on schedule. They were offered education classes, English lessons, typing, basic literacy. Greta found herself gaining weight, her skin clearing, her body recovering from years of wartime deprivation. The cognitive dissonance grew with every passing day. They were being treated better as prisoners than they'd been treated as loyal servants of the Third Reich. The guards were their own education in the collapse of Nazi ideology. The MP detachment was mixed, white soldiers, black soldiers, Hispanic soldiers, working together with a casual integration that would have been illegal in their own country's civilian life. Many of the African American troops served in support and military police roles due to America's own segregation policies, an irony not lost on the more educated prisoners. Here were black men enforcing the discipline that protected German women, while Nazi racial theory crumbled in real time before their eyes. Greta watched Sergeant Washington, from Alabama, she'd learned, physically prevent a drunk GI from entering the compound one evening. The man was court-martialed 3 days later. Sexual assault cases were taken seriously in the American Army, though enforcement was imperfect and justice inconsistent. Still, the fraternization policy remained officially in effect until July, then gradually relaxed under the weight of practical reality. But the guards maintained their distance, never coming within arm's reach unless absolutely necessary. Another prisoner, an older woman named Frau Dietrich, put it bluntly, "They act like we have a disease." Later I realized the disease was fascism, and they were protecting themselves from catching it. The watchtowers were manned constantly, but Greta noticed something strange. The weapons pointed outward. The Americans weren't just guarding them, they were protecting them from the chaos outside, from displaced persons seeking revenge, from the violent disorder of a continent in collapse. Small kindnesses appeared in unexpected places. A guard shared chewing gum with children in the family compound. Another taught teenage boys how to throw a baseball, that incomprehensible American obsession. The paperwork became a running joke among the prisoners. Everything in triplicate, forms for forms, bureaucracy as a kind of secular religion. It was the most boring captivity imaginable, and that ordinariness was itself extraordinary. June 3, 1945. Greta had volunteered to teach English to other prisoners, partly to stay busy, partly because language felt like a bridge to understanding. Lieutenant Morrison, the camp education officer from New York, college-educated and professionally distant, began stopping by her classes. Their first real conversation happened almost by accident. She asked him the question that had been haunting her for weeks, "Why don't you hate us?" His answer came slowly, carefully. "I hate what you did. I hate what you believed. But I don't hate you for being human." Then he showed her the photographs. Buchenwald. The Bergen-Belsen. General Eisenhower had ordered German civilians and POWs to tour the liberated concentration camps, to see with their own eyes what had been done in their name. The images were overwhelming, piles of emaciated bodies, skeletal survivors, industrial-scale murder documented in horrifying detail. Greta's nausea wasn't just from the images themselves but from the recognition of her own complicity. "We didn't know" became impossible to maintain when faced with American, British, and Soviet photographs all showing the same systematic horror. Margaret, a 42-year-old former BDM leader, refused to look. Allied propaganda, she spat, turning away. But the evidence was too vast, too coordinated, too meticulously documented to dismiss. The Nazis, ironically, had been excellent record keepers. Their own files convicted them. The unbearable mercy came from Captain David Levy, a Jewish-American interrogator whose grandparents had fled Germany in 1938. He interviewed Greta about her unit's activities with professional thoroughness, without vengeance, without personal animus. He could have hurt her. He had every right. His people had been murdered systematically, and yet he offered her coffee during the interrogation, treated her with more humanity than she'd been taught to show anyone deemed racially inferior. The camp population began to divide. Those who could accept reality and those who retreated further into denial. Greta wrote letters home, censored but allowed, trying to explain to her mother what she was learning. By summer 1945, over 800,000 German POWs sat in American custody across Europe, and whispered comparisons circulated among them. The women captured by the Soviets in the East, those stories hadn't been propaganda. The gratitude became complicated, layered with shame. They were glad to be American prisoners, and that relief itself felt like a betrayal of something, though none of them could articulate what. August 1945, after V-Day, war in Pacific continues. The re-education began in earnest once victory was official. Mandatory screenings became part of camp routine, newsreels of concentration camp liberations, footage being compiled for war crimes trials, documentary evidence that made denial physically difficult. Greta attended every session, sitting in the front row of the makeshift theater, hungry now for truth after years of carefully curated lies. The American military government had long-term plans for German reconstruction, and those plans began with forcing Germans to confront what they'd enabled. Nuremberg prosecutors' preparation materials were shared with prisoners, not as punishment, but as education. The scale became impossible to ignore. 6 million Jews, millions of others, systematic industrial murder documented in meticulous German records. Greta's internal narrative shifted from, "we didn't know," to the more honest, "we didn't want to know." Reading materials appeared in the camp, confiscated copies of American newspapers, Time magazine, democratic philosophy texts that had been banned for over a decade. She learned about American freedom of the press while imprisoned, an irony she appreciated in a dark way. Thomas Mann's radio broadcasts were played over the camp loudspeakers, A German intellectual explaining their moral collapse to Germans who'd stopped listening to intellectuals years ago. Some prisoners still resisted. "This is Victor's justice," Margaret insisted. "More propaganda." But the evidence was too vast, too coordinated, too detailed to dismiss. And the Nazis' own obsessive record-keeping had created an unimpeachable paper trail of their crimes. October 1945. Greta received her release papers on a cold morning that smelled like autumn and new beginnings. She was among the first wave, women and older men released first, while younger male POWs were held longer for security screening and labor details. Final processing involved a health certificate that declared her fit, travel documents, an Allied-issued identification card that would mark her as cleared for re-entry into civilian life. She received a small payment, accumulated wages from 6 months of camp work. A railroad pass back to Munich completed the package. What was left of Munich, anyway? She found Lieutenant Morrison before leaving and thanked him. His response was characteristically American, direct, optimistic, demanding. "Don't thank me. Do better. Build better." She boarded the train with other released women, watching the German landscape roll past the windows. Destroyed bridges hastily repaired. Bombed-out cities reduced to rubble and skeletal buildings. Displaced persons camps overflowing with refugees from across Europe. The contrast was stark, German POWs emerging from American camps healthier than they'd entered, while German civilians outside the wire starved and scrounged for survival. Munich was 60% destroyed. Greta picked her way through rubble-lined streets to her family's apartment building, miraculously still partially standing. Her mother and sister were alive, living in 3 rooms with no windows and a roof that leaked. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. Her brother was missing, presumed dead somewhere in the retreat from Russia. The reunion was tears and embraces and the inevitable question, "What happened to you? What did they do?" Greta's truth sounded like a lie. "They fed us. They left us alone. They treated us like human beings." Her mother couldn't process it. Years of Goebbels' warnings about American savagery had prepared her for a different story. "But the Americans?" Goebbels said. Her voice trailed off, confronting the possibility that everything had been lies. The painful education began again, this time with her own family. Greta had to explain everything. The camps, the systematic murder, the documented evidence, the reality of what had been done in their name. Her sister, 19 and still young enough to shatter completely, broke down. "Everything we believed was a lie." Not everything, Greta told her, but everything that mattered. 1946–1947. Greta found work with the American military government as a translator. Thousands of Germans were employed in reconstruction efforts, their knowledge of local systems and language making them valuable despite their compromised pasts. She helped process displaced persons' claims, worked with refugee resettlement programs, saw Jewish survivors returning to reclaim property and search for family members who were almost certainly dead. The work felt like penance, inadequate, necessary, the only thing she could do. She could never undo what had happened, but she could help rebuild something better from the ashes. Some former auxiliaries became valuable assets in denazification trials. Greta testified against local Nazi Party members, telling what she'd seen and heard during the war years. It wasn't heroic. She wasn't forgiven, and shouldn't be. But she was useful, and utility was its own form of redemption. Letters arrived from other former prisoners. Ilse had become a nurse, dedicating her life to humanitarian work. Margaret had committed suicide in 1947, unable to reconcile past and present. Studies would later show that German POWs held in American custody integrated better into post-war society than those held by other powers, the paradox of captivity becoming liberation from ideology's comfortable lies. Greta kept the empty cyanide vial on her dresser, a reminder of the death she'd expected and the life she'd received instead. "They could have brutalized us," she wrote in her journal. "They had every reason. Instead, they showed us what civilization looks like." That lesson hurt more than any beating could have. In 1949, she stood in the ruins of Berlin watching American airlift planes supply the blockaded city. Yesterday's enemies had become today's protectors. The Americans never laid a hand on them. Instead, they taught them to stand on their own again. If this story of unexpected humanity in the aftermath of history's darkest war moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories from World War II that challenge what you thought you knew. And in the comments, tell me, what surprised you most about this account? Let's keep this conversation going.